On June the 28th, 1914, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, took place a tragic assassination, which then within about 5 weeks caused or triggered the start of the First World War. The victims were the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Countess Sophie, or Duchess Sophie. The assassin was a former Bosnian Serb student, Mr. Gavrilo Princip. He belonged to a Serbian terrorist group whose goal was the creation of a united southern Slavic states containing, for example, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Montenegrins, and Macedonians. Their dream actually was achieved after the First World War ended in 1918 with the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes that in 1929 was renamed Yugoslavia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand wanted to reunify or to make strong again the Austro-Hungarian central government. Austria-Hungary had been a dual monarchy, or a personal union of Austria and Hungary since the Ausgleich or Compromise of 1867 that had given both regions of Austria self-government. They had no common government. They each had their own governments, parliaments, and laws, but they did have the same ruler, who was called Emperor in the Austrian side, and King in the Hungarian side. He was Franz Joseph, who was Franz Ferdinand's uncle. They also had common foreign policy, a common army, and a common defense, therefore, and a common currency. However, there were many Slavic nationalities living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, such as Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and they constituted also a growing group because of, generally speaking, high birth rates. Still, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had in practice an autocratic and plutocratic political system where the German, Austrian, and Hungarian aristocrats dominated the empire. Yes, in the Austrian part of the empire, all adult male citizens got the right to vote in 1907, but because of nationalist agitation and possibly because of underdeveloped democratic experience, the Austro-Hungarian federal or imperial parliament was not that effective, and during the First World War, it wasn't even called into session. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's goal, in order to strengthen the Austro-Hungarian central government, was to give self-government to various Slavic nations and a few other ones like the Hungarian Seklers or Saklars in what is now Western Romania. He wanted to somehow reduce the dominance of German, Austrian, and Hungarian aristocrats. But he wasn't a liberal democrat who wanted a self-determination for the nationalities, because that, of course, would have broken up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1903, in Serbia, there had been a bloody military coup where King Alexander I Obrenović and his wife Queen Draga had been brutally assassinated, and thus the Karađorđević dynasty had entered the throne, with Peter I becoming the Serbian king. The new dynasty was more nationalist than the previous one, the Obrenović dynasty. It was friendlier to Russia and less friendly to Austria-Hungary. And gradually, in the 19th century, had grown a South Slavic movement. Its more moderate members were basically cultural nationalists and linguistic nationalists who didn't want to use violence in order to achieve a united South or Southern Slavic state. Its more radical members then were prepared to use violence, and a notable portion, a notable but and a vocal minority of, for example, students, school and university students, were open to this nationalist agitation. And these radical Southern Slavic nationalists feared that if Franz Ferdinand became the new Austro-Hungarian emperor, which could actually be imminent since Emperor Franz Joseph was already 83 or 84 years old at the time of his nephew's assassination, then most Slavs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire wouldn't want to break away from it, because they would have too good position. They would have had too many of their demands satisfied within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there were various conspirators in the Serb nationalist and terrorist organization Black Hand. Not just Gavrilo Princip, who at the time of the assassination was, according to official documents, 19 years old, born in July 1894. But there were also such conspirators as Danilo Ilic, then Colonel C.A. Popovic in Serbia, and then there was that chief of the Serbian military intelligence, Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, who, because of his diligence, was known as Apis, or the Ant. And then there were such conspirators as Muhammad Mehmed Bashic, who was a Muslim, Vladimir Gatsinovic. Then there was Trifko Grabej, Serbian youths Vaso Čubrilović and Cvjetko Popović, and then Nedeljko Čabrinović. And three of these conspirators, Princip, Grabej, and Čabrinović, lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was at the time a province or region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they agreed to assassinate the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in order to nullify his plans to at the same time federalize the Austro-Hungarian Empire and strengthen its central government. It has been claimed by some historians that the Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic knew of the conspiracy and had tried, through the cooperation of some Serbian police officers and soldiers, to prevent the slipping away into Bosnia-Herzegovina of those Serb nationalist and terrorist conspirators who lived in Serbia, but that he, maybe for security reasons, didn't inform the Austro-Hungarian government, or he wanted to protect his own reputation, maybe among the Serb nationalists. Franz Ferdinand and his entourage made some crucial mistakes. The date was a mistake because the date was according to the old Julian calendar, the 525th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo Polje, or a field of blackbirds, where Stefan Dusan, who was then the king of Serbia, was killed. And as a result, Serbs were enslaved and occupied by the Ottoman Turks. And also publishing their route through Sarajevo beforehand was of course a mistake, a crucial mistake, because it allowed these Black Hand conspirators to position themselves at several points along their route. In the motorcade there were 3 cars. In the first in the third car were traveling Franz Ferdinand, Sophie, then Governor Potiorek, and Lieutenant Colonel Count Franz von Harrach. And according to the program, at precisely 10 o'clock that morning, the motorcade would leave the barracks, the military barracks, for the town hall by way of the Apel Quay. The motorcade passed the first assassin, Mehmed Basic, who failed to act, maybe out of fear or nervousness, and so did Shubrilovic. But at 10 a.m., as Franz Ferdinand's car was approaching, Chabrinovic threw his bomb that bounced off the convertible covers folded back into the street. So it missed its target, Franz Ferdinand. Instead it exploded under the next car and wounded between 16 and 20 people. Chabrinovic swallowed his cyanide pill. All of the assassins had been given revolvers and cyanide pills, so that having fired their, hopefully, in their opinion, hopefully fatal shots, they would then commit suicide. But the cyanide pills were probably too old or then too weak and had lost their effectiveness. They only made those conspirators who tried to swallow them vomit, and such was the case in Chabrinovic's position. He jumped into the Miljatska River, but that was only 13 centimeters or slightly over 5 inches deep, because the summer of 1914 in Bosnia, like in most of the rest of Europe, had been hot and dry. So police officers dragged Chabrinovic out of the river, and the crowd severely beat him before he was taken into police custody. The Archduke's procession nevertheless drove to the town hall. Understandably angered at the incident, Archduke Franz Ferdinand protested or interrupted Mayor Tsurcic's prepared welcome speech to protest. "Mr. Mayor, I come here on a visit and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." Then Duchess Sophie was able to calm him by whispering something, perhaps "Bitte Franzi" or "Please Franzi." And then the Archduke allowed the mayor to continue his speech. He then gave his own speech, and to his prepared text he added a few remarks about the day's events and thanked Sarajevo's people for cheering him and clapping hands to him in order to express their approval of his survival of that assassination attempt. And then there was division between Franz Ferdinand's assistants and advisors on what to do next. Baron Rummerskirch proposed that the Archduke and his wife should remain at the town hall until Austro-Hungarian troops could be brought into Sarajevo. to line the streets. Governor General Oskar Potiorek claimed that if soldiers were brought straight into the city, they wouldn't have the dress uniforms that they should have for such duties. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie wanted to visit the wounded in a hospital, and Count Harrach then took up a protective position on the left-hand running board of Franz Ferdinand's car, which was an open-top car, as most cars were 100 years ago. At 10:45 a.m. they left the town hall, once again in the third car. General Potiorek decided that the royal car or imperial car should travel straight along the Apel Quai into the Sarajevo hospital. But he, for some reason, didn't inform the driver, Leopold Loika, about this. So Loika took a right turn into the Franz Joseph Street. And actually, the reason for that was that Potiorek's assistant, von Meritzi, was in the hospital and couldn't advise the driver Loika about that changed route. And because Loika took a wrong turn, Governor Potiorek called out to him to reverse and take the Quai to the hospital. Then driver Loika stopped the car close to where Princip was standing, in a delicacy shop. And then Princip hardly could believe his good luck, having his intended victim, the Archduke, just a few meters from him. He stepped up, and from a distance of about 1.5 meters or 5 feet, he fired 2 shots. The first one accidentally hit Duchess Sophie in the stomach, while the second one hit Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein, or then the reverse. Anyway, those were their injuries. Princip was immediately arrested, and the crowd brutally beat him before the police officers took him to custody. In the trial, he said that he regretted shooting Duchess Sophie because he would have wanted to shoot and kill Governor Potiorek himself. Duchess Sophie, when she saw blood oozing from the neck wound of the Archduke, said, "For heaven's sake, what has happened to you?" And then she appeared to faint, and her head sank in her husband's lap. Archduke Franz Ferdinand said to her, Sophie dear, don't die. Keep alive or stay alive for our children's sake." They had 3 children. As an aside, they had got married in 1900 because they were deeply in love with each other, and because Duchess Sophie was a countess, a Czech countess. She wasn't considered an imperial or even a royal person, and therefore Archduke Franz Ferdinand's uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, only allowed them to get married on the condition that their children would not inherit the Austro-Hungarian throne. In other words, the marriage was made morganatic, and Duchess Sophie had to stand in all imperial receptions far away from her husband. Count Harrach then asked Archduke if he was suffering much, and the Archduke answered, "It is nothing," and he repeated that answer 6 or 7 times, even though he grew weaker and weaker. Depending on the accounts, both victims of the shooting were still alive when the car arrived to the governor's residence, or then the Duchess had already died of her wounds. Franz Ferdinand died shortly after arriving to the governor's residence. Some 4 weeks later, Austria-Hungary presented an ultimatum to Serbia that was so worded that Serbia couldn't accept the ultimatum without compromising its independence. The one clause, one demand that Serbia couldn't accept, at least not unconditionally, was that Austro-Hungarian soldiers and police officers would be free to hunt down members of the Serbian nationalist and terrorist organizations whose aim was to create a greater Serbia in southeastern Europe. The Serbian government replied that such a demand could only be accepted to the extent that it conformed to the international law, meaning each country's, independent country's, sovereignty. The other demands, such as the dismissal of all teachers and other education officials who were linked with the Greater Serbian movement, and the suppression of all anti-Austrian propaganda and pro-Greater Serbian propaganda in Serbia, those demands the Serbian government wanted to accept. In Austria-Hungary, only people who had turned 20 could be condemned to death. And because, according to his official records, like passport, Gavrilo Princip was still some weeks short of his 20th birthday when he assassinated the Archduke and the Duchess. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, as were Neđeljko Čabrinović and Trifun Grabej. Vaso Čubrilović was sentenced to 16 years, Cvjetko Popović to 13 years, Lazar Dukic to 10 years, Mitar Kerović was sentenced to life in prison, Ivo Kranjcević to 10 years, while Branko Zagorac and Marko Perin were sentenced to just 3 years, and Svijan Stjepanović to 7 years, and 9 defendants were acquitted. But Danilo Ilić, Veljko Čubrilović and Mihailo Jovanović were hanged in February 1915, and Neđo Kerović was first sentenced to hanging, but it was commuted to 20 years in prison by the old emperor Franz Joseph based on the finance minister's recommendation. Eventually, Colonel Dmitrievich was also hanged. What else should I say? Well, this, of course, aroused nationalist and even xenophobic passions on both sides of the Austro-Hungarian or the Austro-Hungarian-Serbian border, and because of the alliance systems, Austria-Hungary was backed by Germany, and then later by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, while then Serbia was backed by Russia, France, Britain, and later by Romania. Serb nationalists, generally speaking, considered these men, especially Gavrilo Princip, as heroes, and for a long time his steps were carved in concrete or reinforced by concrete on the street where the assassination took place. Already 1 week after the assassination, in the first week of July 1914, the German Emperor Wilhelm II gave his assurance to Ambassador Berchtold that the Austro-Hungarian-Serbian dispute could escalate into a severe international crisis, and that in that case Austria-Hungary could count on Germany's unconditional support. In other words, he gave Berchtold and therefore Austria-Hungary a blank check of support. At the trial, Čabrinović did claim to regret the murders. As for Princip himself, he was racked by tuberculosis, so that eventually his right arm had to be amputated. He was ordered to fast, that is, not to eat any food for 1 day per month, and also on the anniversaries of the assassination, he was taken to a dark cell in bare clothes. Anyway, he died in Terezín, Bohemia, now in the Czech Republic. Terezín would be known later as Theresienstadt during the Second World War, and there the German Nazis built a so-called model concentration camp where also various foreigners were allowed to visit. He died anyway in Terezín in April 1918, aged 23, of tuberculosis. Some historians have suggested that those young Serb nationalists like Gavrilo Princip, who were suffering from tuberculosis, knew they didn't have much time to live, and this encouraged them to take part in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand so that they could achieve something great before they died.